Cursing is a peculiar art. I practice as much as I can. But in my opinion, it is a sadly failing art in American culture. Our curses are very few, and they're very crude. 4 centuries ago, Shakespeare peppered his plays with almost throwaway insults that were brilliant. "Sir, my desire is that we become much better strangers. I could endure anything before but a cat, and now he is a cat to me. Or shall we meet as little as possible?" We would not generally tell someone that they're fat, but from a more subtle time, the English might say, "By truth, thy girth doth make a millstone look a feather." We have no more imagination than to just say that someone is ugly, but in ancient times they would say, "Thy vile canker-blossomed countenance curdles milk and sours beer." I'm not encouraging you to be rude. I'm just saying that if you are going to be rude, try to be imaginative about it. Use some creativity. Cursing in our era tends to be one of only 2 things. You might hear someone telling someone to go to a place of eternal torment, which clearly expresses some sincere anger, but the other common curse wishes a sexual encounter on another person, which as curses go doesn't make any sense at all. Our curses are either wishing someone eternal torment or brief ecstasy, which makes no more sense than angrily saying, "I hope your daughter gets admitted to Harvard," or "I hope you get a substantial promotion at work." The one I can't make any sense out of, but the former comes from a much deeper necessity for us. A necessity because the world itself is unfair. It is especially unfair to people who find themselves living in a country that's being occupied by a foreign military. It's unfair to slaves who are bought and sold. It's unfair to the poor who are defined by either caste or class or race to be perpetually poor, generation after generation. Something innate in our souls calls out for justice. And in the most ancient strata of human religious thinking, the gods and demons meted out reward and punishment instantaneously. Earthquakes, floods, droughts, volcanoes, plagues were signs of God's wrath, but bumper crops, healthy births, victory on the battlefield were signs of God's favor. The system, however, proved to be unsatisfactory. Sacrificing animals really doesn't make it rain, it doesn't make crops grow. Carrying religious idols or emblems into battle will not ensure victory if you're outnumbered and outarmed. Our ancestors could not accept, however, that God was either indifferent or unjust. But if you just look at the events of history of your current era, a plausible case could be made that God is either indifferent or unjust or just plain ineffective. So various religious solutions for this dilemma have been offered through the centuries. Reincarnation continues to be inviting to many people because if life sucks this time around, you have infinite opportunities for life to suck even more. It was in ancient Persia that a religious leader put into words the solution that seems to have stuck, at least for modern Christians and Muslims and some Jews. Our ancestors long held fairly nebulous views about any hope of a life beyond this life. Ancient Jews had almost nothing to say about it beyond some shadowy house of Sheol where your nephesh, which isn't quite a soul, just a life force, would just kind of creep through the crevices into the ground and sort of linger unconscious in dark caves. In ancient Egypt, only the demigod pharaohs had a future. They would live forever, and the rest of you folks, well, sucks to be you. The Persians, however, envisioned through Zoroastrianism a belief that all of us march from life towards eternity. And we have to cross a bridge, the Shinvolt Bridge, which unfortunately goes over an everlasting fire. And if you have lived a good life, right thoughts, right speech, right actions, the Shinvolt Bridge is wide and flat. If, however, you have not lived a good life, the Shinvolt Bridge turns on its side and is as narrow as the blade of a knife, and you fall into eternal fire. Now, the Hebrew slaves that had been captured by Babylon and taken into captivity were exposed to this very convenient religious belief while they were there as slaves. And they could think of any number of people, if you're a slave, for whom the bridge really ought to give it a good 100 or 90-degree turn. And they then brought that idea back to them in post-exilic Judaism, which then gave birth to Christianity and later to Islam. I say that it's a convenient religious conviction because it allows us to believe that God is just, that even though the world looks unfair, that in the next world everything will be made right. All of the injustices will be corrected. The righteous will be rewarded even if they didn't get much reward in this life. The unjust will be punished even if they seem to make out like bandits in this life. On the one hand, that hope becomes a way of tolerating the gross injustices of living. But on the downside, it becomes a tool for keeping people in oppression. African slaves introduced to Christianity in North America were told if only they would be obedient and work hard, enduring their life of misery and want, that they would have untold riches and joy in the world to come. Even St. Paul lends his voice to the conviction that this life is temporary, so that whatever we have to endure in this life cannot be compared to the glory that we will experience for eternity in the next life. Therefore, you should suffer in silence, setting your hope on what is unseen, unknown, unprovable, a reward for which there is not a scrap of evidence, the ultimate pig in a poke, pie in the sky in the by and by, and a promise for which no one even has the opportunity to file a complaint of false advertising. The threat of hell is then used not only to keep the poor and the enslaved in compliant service, but it's also used to keep women in abusive relationships, to tell young men and young women that those urges stirring within them will not only lead them to incurable diseases and unwanted pregnancy, but also into an eternity in a place where the flame is unceasing and the worm never dies and there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, which never actually kept anyone from having sex, but it did invest the experience with all kinds of internal conflict and guilt and despair. In very recent years, several evangelical authors have found the courage to take a look at this issue and begun to question whether we really ought to rationally talk about the existence of a burning hell. A book entitled Love Wins made a huge stir in the evangelical community, suggesting that a loving God maybe really won't burn you up for millions and billions of years for doing things that evolution insists that you do. When I was attending the Wild Goose Festival this summer, the film Hellbound was being hawked by its producers, and the largely evangelical preachers who spoke at that event were nearly doing cartwheels in joy as the movie traces the myth of hell back through Zoroastrianism into its influences in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Something that they would have known if they had bothered to go to a decent school. But it only seems to infuriate them when I point that out. And they generally have to fall back on one of two insults that they know, one of which makes no sense at all, and the other had just been debunked. It's very awkward when I go to those meetings. In this, we stand at the open mouth of a dark cave with our pre-civilization ancestors. We do not know what, if anything, happens when we die. They didn't know, and we don't know. We seem to have an innate hope We have an abundance of ideas and experiences and accounts of angelic sightings and ghosts and bright lights and voices, all of which adds up to absolutely no proof of anything at all, no certainty, no conclusions, other than that, like that caveman standing in the opening of the cave, we have hope. Like so many aspects of religions which began as revolutionary movements of the poor expressing defiance against the powerful, hell is a piece of a formula in search for ultimate justice. That there are people who are so evil, circumstances so unjust, that surely God will not let it go without some settling of accounts, some justice on the other side of what we can see right now. But then, as all surviving religions eventually become state religions, the threat of hell is used against the weak and the oppressed to keep them in compliance and to control their lives. What the emerging church must realize is that the spiritual life either has value in and of itself or it has no value at all. When I was a young preacher in Louisville, Kentucky, I taught a Wednesday evening Bible study in the church's fellowship hall there on Taylorsville Road, and I had 30 or 40 people in the class. But the next major road to the west was Bardstown Road, and there was a very large bar there that on Wednesday nights held the Naughty Nighty competition. So I regularly thanked those people in attendance at Bible study for choosing to read the Gospels with me rather than going to the Naughty Nighty competition at the Toy Tiger. But as I looked at some of the young college students in the class, I thought I could detect a certain discomfort with the choice that they had made. And here is the real issue. If you are in Bible study when you would rather be at the Toy Tiger because you are afraid of going to hell, then you have been tricked. Like all of you, I have hope for life in the future, and I can even add to that a bit of faith in a loving and kind God, so that whatever happens after death, I am willing to trust God with that. An engaged spirituality, a religion embedded in the real world, has to open its eyes to look at what exists, what we can see, what we can know, what we can influence, what we can change, what we can affect through a faithful understanding of life. Our innate feeling that the world is unjust and that somehow God still favors justice, that's not wrong. That's a good thing. We just anesthetize that sentiment that the world should be more just by talking about all the justice happening in a world we can't see, can't know, and don't know that there will be any balancing of the scales. The whole heaven and hell gamble takes out of religion its moral force. Your passion for justice, your desire to ameliorate human suffering, to share the resources of the world with those who are in need, that is holy. And anything that keeps you from working on making those things happen, anything that tells you to disengage and leave it in the hands of an unknown hereafter, that, I submit, is the opposite of spirituality. In fact, when you think about it, it's not religion, it's just old-fashioned stupid. Some people sitting at their desk watching this sermon on YouTube will protest, but Jesus warned us to carefully avoid the unquenchable fire of hell. It's right there in the 9th chapter of Mark. And I can stand here and tell you that the preponderance of New Testament scholars, from the members of the Jesus Seminar to the Ivy League schools, any of them that you want to name, would tell you that though the early church wrote such texts into the Gospels, that the historical Jesus just wouldn't have said those things. But I'm here to tell you that even if he did say those things, that in the 21st century, you need to have the courage to say that even Jesus could be wrong about that. Jesus was, at least in part, a product of the same culture that inherited that Persian influence in religion. And so the language that Jesus spoke was the language that he grew up hearing Jesus didn't speak English, he spoke Aramaic. He was influenced by the culture and the environment in which he grew up. And so there was present in his DNA a sense of that heaven and hell gamble. Jesus is a part of a culture that believed in a flat earth, that believed that there was a hard firmament like a bowl over the earth, and that windows were opened in it by angels or gods to let the rain fall from the water above to the earth beneath. Really believed that the sun was reignited every morning as God drug it across the sky. So someone that doesn't know where the sun goes at night might be mistaken about that heaven and hell gamble. What we as spiritual people in the 21st century must do is to examine the heart of our faith, what we have inherited from the message of Jesus that preaches good news to the poor, liberation to the captives, telling us to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless, and to pay fair wages to our laborers. That's in the prophets. That's in the Gospels. That is in the preaching of the apostles and the testimony of the saints. Now, you'll not often hear me quoting that 18th century Irish-American revivalist Alexander Campbell, but this one thing he said that I hope you will always remember, that if Christians will get down on their knees and pray for anything for which they will not afterwards stand up and go to work and sacrifice to accomplish, they are only insulting God and disappointing themselves. We know enough about hell in the here and now without wasting time speculating about the afterlife. Hell is when a middle-class legislator can make it illegal for poor women to manage their own bodies when those same legislators can afford to send their daughters to Canada or Europe to have any medical procedure that they choose. Hell is living in a nation with enough empty, foreclosed-upon houses to house every homeless person in the country, but no one seems to be willing to do the math to get the homeless people into the empty houses. Hell is fighting the bloodiest domestic war in history to end slavery in this nation and then blithely accepting slave-produced goods and food because it comes from a nation where we don't have to look at the slaves. Hell is telling people that they have to get off welfare and go to work when we have devised and supported a transportation system where to go to work you have to buy a car, insurance, gas, pay the taxes and fees to license it to get to work. And add to that, here in Springfield, we have a public transit system that is designed to keep people from riding it because it costs city utilities money to subsidize those buses, so they intentionally design a route to keep people off of the buses. And yet we tell poor people, why don't you get a job and go to work? Hell is sending the poor of this nation to kill the poor of another nation, to keep the transfer of wealth into the hands of the few, sailing on a sea of blood of the unsuspecting, compliant, and obedient poor. What does your religion have to say to that? If you demand that the message of Jesus remain imprisoned in a religion that does not speak to the hell we know in favor of one that doesn't exist, then I've got a couple of cryptic curses for you. And you can take your pick of which one you like the best. I just insist that you stay out of our way because we're trying to change the world so that the will of God is done on earth.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.